On the morning of July 25, 1944, General Omar Bradley made a decision that would unleash one of the most devastating bombardments of the Second World War directly onto his own advancing troops. The choice would cost the lives of more than 200 American soldiers, wound another 600, and set off a chain reaction of consequences that would reverberate to the final months of a European campaign. Yet what makes this moment truly extraordinary is not the tragedy itself, but the terrible calculus that led a respected commander to authorize a bombing strategy he believed might destroy his own men. This is a story of how a man tasked with winning a war found himself trapped between two impossible options, and the hidden cost of the choice he ultimately made. The invasion of Normandy had begun just 3 weeks earlier. On June 6th, American, British, and Canadian forces had stormed the beaches in what would become history's largest amphibious assault. The initial beachhead was secured, but progress inland had been agonizingly slow. The American forces found themselves mired in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy that made rapid movement nearly impossible. Tanks became easy targets. Infantry units were channeled down narrow lanes where German defenders could concentrate their fire. Day after day, American casualties mounted while territorial gains measured in hundreds of yards. The momentum of invasion had stalled. To understand why Bradley made the choice he did, we must first understand the desperation he faced. By late July, the American First Army had been grinding away in Normandy for 3 weeks. The British and Canadians, under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was supposed to anchor the left flank and draw German armor toward the eastern part of the beachhead. But Montgomery's forces had failed to capture the city on their first day, and German panzer divisions had thwarted every attempt at a decisive breakthrough. The entire operation was falling behind schedule. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was becoming increasingly concerned that the Allies might become trapped in a prolonged stalemate, exactly the scenario they had hoped to avoid. For American forces on the western side of the beachhead, the situation was equally dire. They faced the German 7th Army under Field Marshal Paul Hauser, a skilled defensive commander who had consolidated his forces in the hedgerow terrain where they held all the advantage. American soldiers were exhausted, frightened, and mounting casualties were making field commanders increasingly desperate for a solution. The Americans needed a break out of Normandy. They needed to create an opening large enough to pour trucks, tanks, and thousands of fresh troops through the German lines. They needed speed and momentum, and they were running out of time. By late July, Omar Bradley had settled on a plan to achieve this breakthrough. The Americans would launch a major offensive west of the city of St. Lo, a medieval town that had become a crucial point of control. German forces had held the town and the high ground surrounding it, creating a natural strong point. The American objective was straightforward: push the Germans out of St. Lo and advance southward, creating a gap in the German line. But this required overcoming fortified German positions on high ground, where defenders had prepared their defensive lines with care and precision. Bradley was not interested in repeating the slow, grinding, casualty-heavy tactics that had characterized the Bocage campaign. He wanted to break the German line decisively, and he believed that air power was a key. Specifically, he wanted to use heavy bombers. The United States Army Air Forces had thousands of bombers, and they had already demonstrated their capacity to devastate large areas. Why not use them to pulverize the German positions around St. Lo, to destroy fortifications, kill enemy soldiers, and stun the survivors into chaos before American infantry and armor attacked? The idea had powerful appeal. Many officers in the 8th Air Force shared it. Air power advocates had long argued that the right bombing campaign could win battles with minimal ground casualties. But there was a fundamental problem with Bradley's plan, and it was a problem he understood perfectly. St. Lo was a medieval city with a civilian population. More importantly, American forces were very close to the German lines they wanted bombed. The danger of bombing inaccuracy was not theoretical. In fact, American bombers had already delivered friendly fire casualties in Normandy on previous occasions. The risk existed not as some distant possibility, but as a documented reality. Yet Bradley believed the risk was worth taking. He believed that a successful bombardment could shorten the war. He believed that lives saved in the long run by breaking the stalemate would ultimately exceed any losses from friendly fire. And so he made a decision that a heavy bomber campaign would precede the ground assault on St. Lo. What Bradley did not know was that his choice had already been made more complicated by a decision made days earlier. The commander of the 8th Air Force, General Ira Eaker, had already authorized preliminary bombing runs over the St. Lo area. The intention was to degrade German defensive positions, but the results had been unsatisfying. German positions had proven resilient. German soldiers had quickly repaired damage and reoccupied fortifications. The damage done was real, but had not been decisive. So on July 25th, a much larger campaign was planned. This would be different. This would involve hundreds of bombers dropping hundreds of tons of explosives in a concentrated area. This would be devastating. Or at least, that was a hope. The bombing was scheduled to begin in the early morning of July 25th. American bombers would depart from bases in England and fly across the Channel. They would arrive over the target area in the middle of the day. Conditions had to be perfect. The bombers needed good visibility to identify their target. The bombardment was timed to precede a ground assault scheduled to begin in the afternoon. The timing was critical. Bombers would clear the area well before American infantry and armor began their attack. There would be a buffer, a window of time between the last bombs falling and the first Americans advancing. This buffer was supposed to keep American forces safe. But timing, coordination, and weather over the English Channel are never guaranteed. On the morning of July 25th, conditions were marginal. Clouds hung over Normandy. Visibility was poor. Air Force commanders face a choice: delay the operation and wait for better weather, or proceed with reduced visibility and increased risk of bombing error. They chose to proceed. The decision seemed reasonable at the time. Weather conditions were expected to improve. Bombing operations had been conducted under similar conditions before. The operation was already delayed from previous attempts. Commanders wanted to maintain momentum. What happened next has been debated by military historians for nearly 80 years. The exact sequence of events is established, but the causes and the responsibility remain contested. As American bombers approached the target area, some of them experienced difficulty locating their objectives through the cloud cover. Rather than risk missing their targets, some bombardiers decided to bomb visually. Others dropped their payloads on reference points that were only approximately correct. And some bombers, attempting to maintain formation and follow the aircraft ahead of them, dropped their bombs according to signals from lead aircraft, without verifying their exact position. The bombing spread across a wider area than intended. Some bombs struck German positions, but others fell on American lines. The first indication that something had gone terribly wrong came from American troops on the ground. Soldiers reported explosions in their own positions. Officers scrambled to determine what was happening. Communications between ground forces and the Air Force had broken down or were inadequate. Nobody in the immediate area of the bombing could effectively communicate up the chain of command what was occurring. The bombs continued to fall. American soldiers, dug in along their lines, could only take cover and hope the bombardment would end. Medics began moving through the area, treating wounded. Officers began counting casualties. As the bombing finally ended and the dust settled, the full extent of the disaster became clear. More than 211 American soldiers had been killed. Another 496 had been wounded. This was not incidental friendly fire. This was a catastrophe. Many of the casualties occurred among soldiers from the 30th Infantry Division and the 1st Infantry Division, units that were positioned to launch the ground assault. These were supposed to be the shock troops of the breakthrough, the soldiers who would carry the attack forward. Instead, they were now coping with their own dead and wounded. Command structures had been disrupted. Unit cohesion had been damaged. Morale, already fragile from 3 weeks of grinding combat, had been shaken. The immediate response from American commanders was shock and anger. General Norman Cota, a senior officer with the 1st Infantry Division, spoke with cold fury about the bombing. Others demanded to know how this could have happened. There was talk of courts-martial, of investigations, of accountability. The atmosphere was one of rage and betrayal. American soldiers had been killed not by the enemy, but by their own Air Force. The question of who was responsible quickly became complicated. Was the blame on the air crews who had not verified their positions before dropping? Was it on the air commanders who had authorized bombing despite marginal weather? Was it on General Bradley, who had authorized the use of heavy bombers so close to his own lines? Was it on the staff officers who had established the bombing plan? The arguments began immediately and have never fully ended. What is clear is that Bradley himself was devastated by the results. He had authorized the bombing based on his calculation that the benefits would outweigh the risks. He had not anticipated such a catastrophic failure of accuracy. Contemporary accounts suggest that Bradley questioned his own decision-making in the hours after the bombing. There are conflicting reports about his exact words, but the weight of evidence suggests he experienced genuine remorse and self-doubt. Yet the operation continued. American ground forces, despite their losses and disruption, launched their attack on St. Lo that afternoon. And remarkably, the attack succeeded. American forces pushed forward. German defenders, disoriented and damaged by the bombing, despite its inaccuracy, fell back. The breakthrough that Bradley had sought was beginning, but the costs of achieving that breakthrough were now undeniably high. The controversy that erupted around the bombing would not be contained or resolved quickly. Within hours, American newspapers learned of the friendly fire incident. Within days, military correspondents were filing reports that explicitly blamed the bombing campaign for American casualties. The information could not be suppressed or spun into invisibility. Too many witnesses existed. Too many soldiers had died. The public had to confront the fact that American military leadership had made a choice that resulted in American deaths. What happened next reveals something important about both Bradley and about the nature of war command. Bradley did not shy away from responsibility. When presented with criticism, he did not attempt to deflect blame or suggest that the bombing had somehow been unavoidable. Instead, he offered a straightforward explanation of his reasoning. He had believed the bombing would shorten the war. He had calculated that the potential losses from friendly fire were a price worth paying to break the stalemate and achieve a decisive breakthrough. He was prepared to accept that judgment as his responsibility. He acknowledged that the bombing had killed American soldiers, and he accepted that the casualties were real and tragic. Yet Bradley also defended his decision. He argued that the bombing had been effective, that it had contributed directly to the breakthrough at St. Lo, and that the breakthrough had been necessary. He argued that in a longer perspective, the casualties from friendly fire had been far outweighed by American lives saved through the shortening of the campaign that the breakthrough enabled. This argument will become the subject of intense historical debate. Was Bradley correct? Would the war have lasted longer without the breakthrough at St. Lo? Would American casualty figures have been higher overall if the bombing had not occurred? These are counterfactual questions about what would have happened in a scenario that never occurred. They cannot be answered with certainty. What we do know is that the breakthrough at St. Lo did lead to a rapid American advance. Over the following days, American and British forces began to encircle German armies, still in Normandy. By mid-August, German forces found themselves in a desperate situation near Falaise, a town in central Normandy. The possibility of a complete American and British victory, the annihilation of German armies in Normandy, became suddenly real. Hundreds of thousands of German troops were killed, captured, or scattered. The German army in France never recovered from the losses at Falaise. Within weeks, Paris was liberated. Within months, American forces were advancing into Germany. The war in Europe would end in the spring of 1945. Would the same outcome have occurred without the bombing at St. Lo? We cannot know. Military history is full of what-ifs. It is entirely possible that American forces would have broken through German lines eventually, even without the bombing. The Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority. They had air superiority. They had unlimited supplies and reinforcements. Time was on their side. The German army in Normandy was outnumbered and poorly supplied. Eventually, the Germans would have been defeated regardless. But eventually is the key word. Without the breakthrough at St. Lo, the breakthrough might have taken weeks longer. Weeks translate into thousands of additional casualties. Soldiers do not calculate strategy in terms of the number of lives saved or lost. They experience war as an immediate reality of danger and fear and loss. But commanders must think in terms of larger numbers, longer timescales, and a calculus of competing goods and evils. This is the deepest aspect of what made Bradley's choice so consequential and so morally complex. He was not choosing between good and evil. He was choosing between different kinds of harm. On one side of the equation lay the certain harm of the friendly fire bombardment, harm that he authorized knowing it might occur. On the other side lay the potential harm of continued stalemate, prolonged combat, and increased casualties overall. He made a judgment call about which harm was preferable. He was willing to accept responsibility for his choice. He was willing to live with the consequences of his decision. In the months and years after the war, Bradley's name became intertwined with the bombing at St. Lo. For some, he represented sound military judgment in difficult circumstances, a commander who made hard choices and achieved victory. For others, he represented the cold calculus of military leadership, the willingness to sacrifice some lives to save others, a kind of decision-making that disturbed them on a fundamental level. The debate was never fully settled because the underlying question can never be fully settled. Was Bradley right to authorize the bombing? There is no objective answer. There is only judgment, informed by facts and values and perspective. What we know is that Bradley's decision at St. Lo was not unique. Throughout the Second World War, military commanders made decisions that resulted in civilian casualties, friendly fire incidents, and unforeseen consequences. These decisions were made under conditions of incomplete information, time pressure, and the stress of managing hundreds of thousands of lives. Some commanders made decisions that in retrospect appear to have been catastrophic errors in judgment. Others made decisions that achieved their intended objectives, but at tremendous human cost. And still others made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but which later evidence suggested might have been unnecessary or counterproductive. The bombing at St. Lo remained significant not because it was unique, but because it was so thoroughly documented and so openly discussed at the time. Unlike many military disasters, the friendly fire casualties at St. Lo could not be hidden or minimized. They could not be blamed on the enemy or on unavoidable circumstance. They had to be acknowledged as the direct result of an American command decision. This transparency, while uncomfortable, ultimately did something important. It forced American military leadership and American society to confront the reality of combat decision-making. It revealed that winning a war sometimes requires accepting losses that would be unacceptable in any other context. In the decades since the war, the bombing at St. Lo has been re-examined repeatedly. Historians have scrutinized the decision-making process. They have analyzed the weather conditions and visibility that day. They have studied the effectiveness of the bombing and debated whether the breakthrough at St. Lo was truly dependent on that bombing. They have argued about whether the numbers of friendly fire casualties were accurately reported or whether they were underestimated. They have questioned whether Bradley had adequate alternatives available to him. These scholarly debates have been valuable. They have deepened our understanding of what happened that day and why. Yet for all the analysis and debate, the fundamental question remains unresolved. In war, when commanders face circumstances where available options all involve significant costs, how should they choose? Should they prioritize minimizing immediate casualties, even if it means prolonging the war? Should they prioritize achieving victory as quickly as possible, even if it means accepting friendly fire casualties? Should they seek a middle ground, attempting to minimize both immediate harm and prolonged suffering? There is no algorithm that can answer these questions. There is only human judgment, informed by imperfect information and motivated by competing values. What made Bradley's choice particularly significant is that he did not hide from the judgment he had made. He did not attempt to minimize the friendly fire casualties or suggest that they were somehow unavoidable or acceptable as a routine cost of warfare. He acknowledged them. He took responsibility for them. He explained his reasoning openly. And he accepted that his decision was contestable, that reasonable people could disagree about whether he had made the right choice. This openness is not common in military history. Many commanders have attempted to hide their failures or deny their responsibility for casualties. Bradley did the opposite. The legacy of Bradley's decision at St. Lo extends beyond the specific question of that bombing. It touches on broader questions about how we evaluate military leadership. Should commanders be judged by the immediate tactical results of their decisions or by the broader strategic outcomes? Should they be held responsible for unintended consequences of their orders? Should the fact that a decision resulted in friendly fire casualties immediately discredit that decision? Or should we evaluate the decision based on its overall effects and the information available to the commander at the time? Different people will answer these questions differently, but the questions themselves are important and they have no simple answers. Military history in general, and the history of World War II in particular, is filled with decisions that commanders made under conditions of extreme stress and incomplete information. Many of these decisions resulted in casualties that might have been avoided if the information had been different or the time pressure had been less. Some of these decisions were clearly mistakes, wrong choices made by commanders who failed to consider available alternatives or who allowed personal considerations to override sound military judgment. But other decisions were genuinely difficult, made by competent commanders who were doing their best to manage impossible circumstances. The bombing at St. Lo was of this latter type. Bradley was a competent commander. He understood the risks of using heavy bombers close to his own lines. He authorized the bombing anyway, because he believed the potential benefit was worth the risk. He was wrong about the accuracy of the bombing, but we cannot say with certainty that he was wrong about the overall wisdom of the decision, because we cannot know what would have happened if he had chosen differently. We can only know that his choice resulted in a terrible immediate tragedy, and that this tragedy was followed by a successful breakthrough and ultimately by victory in Europe. Perhaps the most important lesson from Bradley's decision is that war involves genuine moral dilemmas, situations where all available options involve significant costs, and where the choice between them cannot be made on the basis of absolute principles. No commander in that situation can be innocent. Any choice will result in someone's death. The question is whether the death is necessary, whether it serves some purpose, whether it is balanced by positive outcomes. These are judgment calls, and they are extraordinarily difficult. Bradley made a judgment call. He was willing to take responsibility for it. He did not hide behind blame or rationalization. He accepted that he had ordered the bombing, and that the bombing had killed American soldiers. That acceptance of responsibility, even in the face of tragedy, is perhaps the most important aspect of his legacy. Today, the bombing at St. Lo remains a point of interest for military historians, for students of World War II, and for anyone interested in understanding how decisions are made in warfare. The site itself has been memorialized. There are monuments and markers that remember the soldiers who died in the bombing, whether killed by enemy fire or killed by friendly fire. They are all remembered. The history of what happened that day has been thoroughly documented. We know who gave the orders and why. We know what happened and what the consequences were. We know more about the bombing at St. Lo than we know about most military operations of World War II. Yet knowing the facts of what happened does not answer the underlying question about whether Bradley made the right choice. That question remains open, and perhaps it should remain open. It should remain open as a reminder that military leadership involves genuine moral complexity, that decisions in warfare have unintended consequences, and that even the right decision by a competent commander can result in tragedy. It should remain open as a way of honoring the memory of the soldiers who died in the bombing by refusing to dismiss their deaths as unfortunate but necessary. Their deaths were real, and they demand to be acknowledged as tragedies, even if those tragedies were incidental to a decision that ultimately served a broader purpose. The story of Bradley and the bombing at St. Lo is ultimately a story about the nature of command in warfare. It is about a man who had to make a decision that would have serious consequences no matter what he chose. He made a decision. It resulted in the deaths of American soldiers, but it also contributed to a breakthrough that helped win the war. Whether the trade-off was justified remains a question that each person must answer for themselves, based on their own values and their own understanding of the nature of warfare. What we can say with certainty is that Bradley faced a genuine dilemma, made a decision based on his best judgment of the circumstances, and accepted responsibility for the consequences. In the context of military command, that is perhaps all anyone can do.